the dimensional rift opened without warning. One moment Kurt Wagner had been mid-teleport between the Xavier Institute's lower corridors and the danger room, a routine bamf he'd executed 10,000 times before, the familiar sulfur-stained darkness of his between space wrapping around him like a second skin. Then something had pulled. Not magnetically, not telekinetically, but cosmically, as though the fabric between dimensions had developed a hunger of its own, a thin place in reality's membrane that his unique mutant biology had accidentally probed like a tongue finding a gap in teeth. The between space had shuddered. The darkness had deepened from its usual brief transit black into something older, something that smelled not of brimstone but of rot and ancient earth and roadkill baking under August sun. And then he was falling. He hit the asphalt hard enough to roll, his tail whipping out instinctively for balance, three-fingered hands splaying against cracked blacktop, still radiating the day's stored heat into the rural night. He crouched there for a long moment, breathing, cataloging, surviving the way the X-Men had trained him to survive, and looked up at a sky he did not recognize. No New York light pollution bleeds orange against low clouds. No Westchester tree line. Just the American rural dark in its full, unmedicated enormity. A two-lane state highway stretching in both directions until it simply ceased to exist against the horizon, flanked by flat Midwestern fields of dead corn standing at attention like scarecrows stripped of their straw. The stars above were obscene in their brightness, the Milky Way a wound across the sky, and the only sound was the dry clicking of insects and the distant, mournful moan of wind moving through those dead stalks. Kurt straightened slowly. His image inducer had been offline for maintenance, Reed Richards borrowing the technology for study, which meant he stood in full blue-furred, yellow-eyed, elf-feared glory on this empty highway. And for the first time in recent memory, that fact caused him zero social anxiety. There was no one to see him. Or so he believed. Maine got. He breathed it softly, turning a slow circle, tail swaying. His teleportation hangover was already fading, the mild nausea, the slight visual distortion that came from genuine dimensional displacement rather than his usual short hops, but the wrongness of this place was settling into him the way cold settles into bone. This was not a parallel Earth he recognized. No cosmic signatures he'd encountered in his years with the X-Men. No psychic background radiation of a mutant-populated world, just absence, and underneath the absence something older, something that made the tiny hairs on the back of his neck, the ones beneath the blue fur, stand at rigid attention. He was about to bamf upward, to get an aerial read on his location, when he smelled it. Not him, not anything he'd brought through the dimensional fold. Something already here, already present, already saturating the August air with a stench that bypassed his brain's rational centers and went straight to the limbic system where fear lives permanently, paying no rent. It was old meat and old earth and something beneath both of those, something older than either, something that had been hunting and feeding and regenerating since before this highway existed, since before the corn existed, since before the people who planted the corn had names for what they feared in the dark. He heard it before he saw it. A truck, massive, black, rust-eaten at its edges like a thing that had been on this road since roads began, was moving toward him from the north without headlights, its engine producing a sound that was less mechanical combustion and more like breathing, like something enormous drawing air through chambers not designed for air. Kurt stood his ground by instinct and training, watching it come, cataloging threat vectors with the practiced calm of a man who had faced sentinels and apocalypse and the very dissolution of reality. The truck passed him, and from the flatbed, something looked back. It was massive, easily 7 feet, wrapped in a long coat the color of dried blood, wearing a wide-brimmed hat that belonged in no century Kurt could confidently name. But it was the face beneath the hat's shadow that reached into his chest and grabbed his heart with cold fingers, because it had no face, not in the human sense. What it had were features arranged in the approximate geography of a face, eyes that caught no light and yet were undeniably, horrifyingly attentive, a mouth too wide, a nose that was more anatomical suggestion than structure. And those features were all oriented toward him with an expression that was not curiosity, not hunger, not yet, but something more deliberate. Recognition. The truck did not stop. It continued south, its brake lights never activating, that breathing engine fatting until only the insect chorus remained. Kurt stood absolutely still in the center of the highway, every combat instinct he possessed screaming at frequencies he usually only heard when facing genuine extinction-level threats. It saw me, he thought. It looked directly at me, and it saw something worth noting. He'd been profiled by Sentinel targeting systems. He'd been assessed by Magneto, by Mr. Sinister, by beings of cosmic power who could read his genetic code like a text. He had never felt assessed the way he felt assessed in that 3-second exchange with whatever rode that flatbed. It had looked at him the way a collector looks at something they have never encountered before in a very, very long collection. He bamfed immediately, 20 feet straight up, landing in a controlled crouch on the only elevated surface available, the corrugated metal roof of an abandoned farmstand set back from the road, its hand-painted price board still advertising sweet corn at $2 a dozen, the paint cracked and peeling and old. From this height, he scanned in every direction, his yellow eyes far better suited to darkness than human eyes had any right to be, and what he saw north of his position made his stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with teleportation sickness. 2 vehicles sat on the highway's shoulder approximately a quarter-mile back, a sedan and a camper van, both dark, both still. Around them, or rather scattered from them in the chaotic geometry of interrupted flight, were objects he recognized with terrible clarity as human belongings. A shoe, a backpack, something that might have been a jacket, something else he refused to look at directly because the shape of it against the moonlit asphalt told him a story he was not prepared to finish reading from this distance. The truck was nowhere in sight. The flatbed was empty. Those were people, Kurt thought, and the thought arrived with the full weight of his vocation, not just as an X-Man, not just as a trained combatant, but as a man of faith who believed with his entire, complicated, blue-furred, demon-blooded soul that every human life carried divine weight. Those were people, and something took them, and I am standing here alone on a highway in a reality I don't recognize, and whatever that thing was, it recognized me. He dropped back to the asphalt. He needed information. He needed to understand what he was dealing with, what this place was, and whether other people were still alive nearby and reachable. He needed most urgently to determine whether the entity on that flatbed had filed him under irrelevant or interesting in whatever passed for its cognitive architecture. He moved north toward the abandoned vehicles at a run, not teleporting, conserving the dimensional energy that bamfing consumed, staying low and using the road's shallow ditch for concealment. The corn watched him with 1,000 dry, rattling eyes. The stars burned cold overhead, and somewhere south of him, that breathing engine was slowing. It had turned around. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. Hope shines brightest in the darkest night. The abandoned vehicles told a story Kurt wished he couldn't read. He moved through the scene with the practiced efficiency of someone who had processed disaster sites before, the smoking ruins of mansions, the wreckage of Sentinel attacks, the aftermath of mutant versus mutant conflicts that left landscapes looking like the surface of a world that had never been intended for habitation. He'd learned to separate emotional response from tactical assessment, to file the horror in a compartment that could be processed later, after survival had been secured. But this scene tested that discipline in ways those others hadn't, because those others had been the result of power meeting power, recognizable forces in recognizable conflict. This was something different. This was what a feeding ground looked like. The sedan's doors hung open on both sides, the engine still running, the headlights carving two pale tunnels into the corn on the road's eastern shoulder. Someone had left in a hurry or been taken mid-exit, which the geometry of the scattered belongings suggested more strongly. A woman's handbag lay appended in the gravel, its contents fanned out in a radius that indicated it had been dropped from a height, not placed. A pair of glasses, one lens shattered. A phone with a cracked screen still displays a half-composed text message that would never be sent. Kurt looked at it only long enough to register that it was addressed to someone named Mom, and began with the words, "We found something on the road," and before he deliberately looked away. The camper van was worse. Its rear doors had been removed, not broken, not pried, but removed. The hinges sheared clean with a precision that spoke of strength operating casually, the way a person might brush crumbs from a table. The interior had been thoroughly searched in the same casual, devastating way. Mattress overturned, cabinets opened, and their contents were distributed across the van's floor with the thoroughness of a predator checking every possible space where prey might conceal itself. A child's drawing was pinned to the van's interior wall, crayon mountains, a yellow sun, stick figures holding hands, and it remained undisturbed, which Kurt found in that moment to be the most terrible detail of the entire scene, that the drawing remained while everything else had been overturned and the people who made it were gone. He crouched beside the van's open rear and pressed two fingers to the asphalt, still faintly warm, recent, within the last 30 minutes, which meant he'd arrived either during or immediately following whatever had happened here, which meant the corn moved. Not wind. The night had gone absolutely still in the way that nights go still when something large and patient decides to stop pretending it isn't there. The stalks, approximately 40 feet east of his position, displaced with the slow, deliberate movement of something that was not concerned about being heard because being heard was not a disadvantage it needed to account for. Kurt rose from his crouch in one fluid motion, tail rising behind him for balance, three-fingered hands opening at his sides, the instinctive preparation of a fighter who has learned that whatever he's facing, he should already be in position before it fully arrives. The creeper came out of the corn the way nightmares come, not all at once, but in pieces, each piece worse than the last. First the hat, then the coat, opening like wings because it was wings, vast, leathery, ancient, the span of them blotting out a generous portion of the star field behind it as the creature straightened to its full height at the corn's edge. Then the face, and Kurt had steeled himself for the face after their highway exchange, had catalogued it from that 3-second assessment, and prepared himself for a second viewing. He had not prepared himself adequately. In the van's ambient light and the star's cold overhead glow, the creeper's face was not merely wrong. It was a theological argument. It was the visual representation of the question that had shadowed Kurt's faith his entire life. Not whether God existed, but what God's existence meant for the existence of this. It was looking at him with what he could only describe as appetite modified by interest. Pure hunger would have moved faster. Whatever was happening in those lightless eyes was something more considered, the assessment of a collector encountering an item outside its established catalog, turning it over, deciding where it fits in the taxonomy of desirable things. Kurt held his ground. This was perhaps the most demanding thing he had ever done. "I know you can understand me," he said, and his voice came out steadier than he had any right to expect. "The way you looked at me on the road, you're not an animal, you're something that thinks." The creeper's head tilted. The motion was disturbingly bird-like, rapid, precise, a predator triangulating sound and smell, and whatever other senses it employed in the construction of its world. Its nostrils, those anatomical suggestions in the approximate position of a nose, flared with an almost theatrical deliberateness. It was smelling him, processing his biology with whatever olfactory architecture had been hunting on this planet since before he was born, before Xavier's school existed, before the word mutant had been coined as either slur or identity. Then it stepped toward him. Kurt bamfed. The sulfur crack of his displacement, the small thunderclap of air rushing to fill the space his body had vacated, was the loudest sound the night had produced since he'd arrived, and it produced an immediate dramatic response from the creeper. The creature stopped. Its head snapped toward the space Kurt had just occupied, wings flaring to their full span, and then it turned with mechanical precision toward the van's roof where Kurt had reappeared, crouching, 12 feet above and slightly behind it. The expression on its face, if expression was a word that could be applied to those features, had changed. The interest had intensified, deepened. Whatever Kurt's teleportation had looked like from the outside, the bamf, the sulfur, the displacement, had apparently elevated him from interesting anomaly to something I have never encountered in a very long time of encountering things. He watched the creature's wings fold and unfold with the slow rhythm of consideration, its head tracking him with a precision that suggested his camouflage in the van's shadow was providing exactly zero tactical advantage. It can smell me regardless of where I go, he realized with a cold clarity that had nothing to do with the August night's temperature. Distance is not a deterrent. The displacement confuses it briefly, maybe 2 or 3 seconds, but it recovers orientation almost immediately. 2 seconds, 3 at most. He catalogued this the way Logan had taught him to catalog threats in the field, not with panic, but with the dispassionate arithmetic of survival. What did he have? Teleportation with a recovery window of approximately 2 to 3 seconds of confusion per jump. Superhuman agility and wall adhesion, which in open terrain with no structures offered limited advantage against something that could fly. Physical strength adequate for human-level threats, deeply inadequate for something that had just removed a van's rear doors with one hand. Shadow camouflage that was functionally useless against olfactory tracking. What did it have? Everything else. He bamfed again, this time to the sedan's roof, and watched the creeper's head snap to his previous position before correcting, that 2-second window playing out in real time. 2 seconds. He was filing this information in the survival compartment of his mind with desperate urgency, because the combat calculus was unambiguous. He could not fight this thing. Not directly. Not here in open terrain, with no intelligence about what actually damaged it, with no allies, with no weapons beyond his own body and his between space. But he could move, and movement was information. Information was the only currency that purchased survival in circumstances like these. He bamfed to a telephone pole 50 yards north. The creeper turned, located him, and then did something that erased the last fragment of Kurt's controlled calm. It smiled. Not the smile of a predator that has cornered prey. The smile, and he used the word with all the inadequacy he recognized it carried, of something that had just decided this was going to be enjoyable. That the chase had become the point. That whatever Kurt's teleportation represented to its ancient taxonomy of hunted things, it had been filed under worthy rather than easy, and that this distinction brought the creeper something disturbingly close to pleasure. It spread its wings. It rose from the ground with a sound like a sail catching wind, vast and leathery and terrifyingly graceful, and Kurt bamfed north along the highway, reappearing running, bamfed again, running again, and behind him he heard the breathing engine of those wings finding their rhythm against the August air, and he understood with complete theological clarity that whatever this creature was, whatever ancient and unkillable thing had been seeded into this reality's darkness, it had been waiting. Perhaps without knowing it had been waiting for something exactly like him to arrive. Something that would make the hunt interesting again. Gott Himmel, he thought, running beneath the obscene brightness of those rural stars. What have I stumbled into? The corn watched without answering. The creeper's wings beat the night air above him with patient, enormous strokes, and 23 years of hunger directed itself, with something approaching joy, at the blue-furred, teleporting mutant from a world this darkness had never tasted before. He ran for 40 minutes before he found the church. Not because the creeper had stopped pursuing him. It hadn't. Not entirely. Its wings audible at irregular intervals above the cloud cover that had rolled in around midnight. That breathing engine of flight appearing and disappearing like a predator that understood the psychological value of intermittent presence. It would vanish for 10 minutes, long enough for Kurt's nervous system to begin negotiating with hope. Then he'd hear it again, closer or seemingly closer, the acoustic properties of open rural terrain making precise location difficult. He'd bamf again, burning dimensional energy he couldn't afford to burn indefinitely, reappearing somewhere new and running again in a direction chosen by instinct rather than intelligence because he had no map, no compass, no landmark beyond the stars and the endless flat geometry of this landscape. He was rationing the teleportation consciously now. Each bamf cost something measurable, not in calories, not in anything as simple as physical fatigue, but in the dimensional attunement that his mutation required the way a muscle requires oxygen. Push it too hard without recovery time, and the jumps became shorter, less precise, the between space growing unstable in ways that could deposit him inside a solid object or halfway through the ground. And those outcomes ended the story considerably faster than the creeper did. So he ran between the teleports, using his agility and the ditch's concealment, staying low, staying quiet, conserving. The church appeared on the horizon as a darker shape against the dark sky, a white clapboard structure set back from the highway on a gravel lot, its steeple pointing at heaven, with the stubborn insistence of a building that had been making that argument for over a century. Its sign, illuminated by a single floodlight running on what must have been a timer or a generator, read Grace Evangelical Lutheran. All are welcome, Sunday service 10 a.m. The parking lot held 2 vehicles, both older model pickup trucks, and light was visible through the stained glass windows. Warm, amber, human light that hit Kurt's chest like a physical force after 40 minutes of rural darkness and ancient predatory breathing. He bamfed directly to the church's front steps, bypassing the open ground of the parking lot, and pushed through the heavy wooden doors without stopping to consider the optics of a blue-furred, yellow-eyed mutant arriving unannounced at a Lutheran church in rural America at 1 in the morning. Inside, 2 people. A man in his 60s, heavyset, farmer's hands, wearing a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, sat in the front pew with the posture of someone who had been sitting there for a long time, working through something difficult. A woman, perhaps 10 years younger, sat in the pew behind him, a sleeping bag around her shoulders, a thermos in her hands, her eyes wide and already on the door when Kurt entered because she'd heard his bamf and had been bracing for whatever came through. They stared at him. He stared at them. The amber light of the church's interior fell across the stained glass depiction of Christ in Gethsemane above the altar, and Kurt registered it the way a drowning person registers a rope, with desperate, complicated gratitude. "I know how I look," he said, in English that carried the soft architecture of his German accent, his hands raised in the universal gesture of non-aggression. "I promise I am not what you should be afraid of tonight. There is something outside that is. I need you to tell me everything you know about it." The man in the front pew turned fully to look at him. His face had the specific texture of someone who had already processed shock that evening, and arrived on the far side of it into a grim, exhausted pragmatism. He looked at Kurt's blue fur, his yellow eyes, his tail, his 3-fingered hands, with the assessment of a man updating his definition of the night's possible contents rather than rejecting the update entirely. "You saw the truck," the man said. "It was not a question." "And what was on it?" Kurt confirmed, lowering his hand slowly. "Yes." The woman, her name was Darla, he learned in the next few minutes, and the man was her Uncle Gerald, and they had driven out from the nearest town when Gerald's neighbor had stopped answering his phone 3 days into what Gerald had been calling a bad feeling, and Darla had been calling "we need to call the police," and neither of them had been wrong, had been in this church for 6 hours. They'd seen the truck. Gerald had seen it once before, 23 years ago, when he was in his 30s and working a night shift at a grain elevator 12 miles north, and a young woman he'd been working with had walked outside for a cigarette break and not come back, and the truck had been the last thing he'd seen on the road before the screaming started. He knew what it was. Not its name, not its taxonomy, not its biology, but its rhythm. He knew the 23-year cycle the way people who live near rivers know flood seasons, not from textbooks but from the specific, inherited dread of communities that have absorbed the pattern into their collective memory without ever fully articulating it. Every generation, people disappeared along these roads. Every generation, there was a truck. Every generation, the disappearances stopped after a certain number of weeks, and the truck was gone, and people found ways not to talk about what they knew. "How many days into the cycle?" Kurt asked, sitting in a pew across the aisle, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, tail wrapped around the pew's back leg. Gerald looked at his hands. 18, he said, maybe 19. My neighbor was the first one I knew about this time. So 5 days remaining, perhaps 4. If it's the same as before. Kurt absorbed this. 23 days of feeding, then dormancy. The creature operated on a biological schedule as fixed as a tide, as impersonal as weather, which meant its horror was not malicious in any psychological sense. It didn't hate its victims. It didn't experience cruelty as cruelty. It experienced hunger as hunger, and it fed on a timetable set by whatever ancient biological machinery it ran on. And the people on these roads were food in the same category as the sweet corn in the fields, present, available, sufficient. This theological clarity, Kurt reflected, did not make it better, it made it worse. "Has anyone ever heard it?" he asked. Gerald and Darla exchanged a look freighted with the specific weight of people who have discussed this question before, and arrived at a conclusion they don't enjoy. "Guns don't stop it," Gerald said. "My father told me someone shot it with a deer rifle in '72. It pulled the bullet out like a splinter and kept going." "Fire. There's a story about a barn fire in the '50s. It walked out." Kurt was quiet for a moment. Outside, distantly, he heard the wing-beat rhythm, passing north of the church, not approaching, the creature quartering the terrain in the systematic way of a predator that had lost a scent and was reacquiring it. He had perhaps 10 minutes before it located him here, maybe less if the wind shifted. "It recognized something about me," he said, thinking aloud, processing with the portion of his mind that had been trained by Xavier to analyze threats with the same rigor applied to solutions. "On the highway from the truck, before it had even smelled me, before I'd moved, it looked at me differently than it would look at a human, and when I teleported, its response changed. The interest increased." "What are you?" Darla asked, not unkindly, with the genuine curiosity of someone whose capacity for wonder had been recently stress-tested and found still functional. "A mutant," Kurt said simply. "My body generates a connection to a dimensional space that allows me to move through it. When I displace, when I teleport, I spend a fraction of a second in a space between spaces. And when I arrive, there is a brief disruption, a sulfur smell, a small sound, and apparently," he paused, working through the implication in real time, "something in my biology that this creature finds novel." "Novel how?" He looked at Gerald. "You said it feeds on people, that it takes parts, specific parts, that those parts seem to strengthen it, add to it." Gerald nodded, jaw tight. "It has been doing this for a very long time," Kurt continued slowly. "Long enough that humanity in all its variation has become a known quantity to it, a catalogue it has been fully explored." He paused. "And then I arrived, something outside its catalogue, something it has never tasted." The silence in the church had the quality of a held breath. "It doesn't just want to feed on me," Kurt said. "It wants to know what it gets if it does." Outside, the wings grew louder. He thought of the people at those abandoned vehicles, their scattered belongings, the half-composed text message to someone named Mom, the child's crayon drawing pinned to the van's wall with the determined optimism of someone who believed they were going somewhere worth decorating for. He thought of Gerald's neighbor, who had stopped answering his phone. He thought of the woman in 1972 who had walked out for a cigarette break and not come back. He thought of 23 years of this, cycling through these roads, taking people with the impersonal rhythm of the weather. And he thought of faith, not the comfortable faith of Sunday mornings and familiar liturgy, but the difficult faith of a man shaped like a demon who had spent his life arguing that God's presence could be found in the most hostile possible circumstances, that meaning could be excavated from even the darkest material, that the very existence of monsters was not evidence against the divine, but was instead the darkness against which light defined itself. He looked up at the Gethsemane window. "I need everything in this building that could function as a weapon," he said, "and I need you both to get to your trucks and drive south without stopping." "We're not leaving you," Darla said immediately. "You are," Kurt said, with a gentleness that left no room for negotiation, "because I cannot do what I need to do if I am also managing your survival. Trust me with this. Get south. Find people. Find lights." Gerald stood, looked at Kurt for a long moment with those farmer's eyes that had been processing difficult realities for 6 decades. "There's a toolbox in the sacristy," he said, "and kerosene for the groundskeeper's equipment in the storage room off the back." Kurt nodded once. "Go," he said, "now, before it finds the scent again." They went, and Kurt Wagner knelt briefly in the front pew of Grace Evangelical Lutheran Church, not from habit, not from performance, but from the genuine and urgent need to spend 30 seconds in conversation with the God he'd been arguing with his entire life before going back outside into the dark. The wings were very loud now. He picked up the kerosene canister from the storage room, a length of chain from the toolbox, and a flare from beneath the driver's seat of Gerald's truck, found through the window, taken without touching the door handle, small mercies, and he stood at the church's tree line and waited for the creeper to come find what it had been hunting. The creeper found him at the tree line, 17 minutes after Gerald's taillights disappeared south. It came from above rather than through the corn this time, a tactical adjustment that told Kurt something important about the creature's intelligence. It had noted the pattern of his ground-level movements and changed its approach vector. This was not the behavior of an animal following instinct alone. This was a predator that learned, that updated its methodology based on observed data, that had been doing exactly that for long enough to have accumulated a library of approaches vast enough to make genuine surprise almost impossible. Kurt had been counting on surprise as his primary tactical asset. The creeper's angle of descent suggested that the asset was significantly devalued. He bamfed the moment he heard the wing beat rhythm change from quartering flight to descent, not far, just 15 feet laterally, behind the oak tree at the church's northeast corner, and watched the creeper land in the exact spot he'd been standing with the controlled force of something that had made 10,000 landings and found none of them particularly challenging. It stood in the floodlight's amber spill and turned its head with that bird-like precision, reacquiring his scent in approximately 4 seconds. 4 seconds. He'd clocked 2 to 3 in the open field. The church's ambient scents, wood polish, candle wax, and the kerosene canister he was carrying were apparently providing marginal interference. He filed this under useful and moved immediately. The plan was not elegant. Kurt had not had time for elegance. What he had assembled in the 30 seconds of prayer and the 17 minutes of waiting was something closer to a hypothesis, a series of actions predicated on 2 observations and 1 assumption. The observations: the creeper's 2 to 3 second disorientation window following each bamf, and its apparent novelty response to his teleportation, the heightened interest suggesting it had not encountered dimensional displacement before. The assumption: that novelty, in a predator old enough to have catalogued everything else, might function as a vulnerability, That something encountering a genuinely new stimulus might, however briefly, prioritize processing over hunting. He needed to test the assumption before he committed to it. Testing it required getting closer to the creeper than every survival instinct he possessed was currently recommending. He bamfed to the church's roof. The creeper's head snapped to his previous position, held for 2 seconds. He counted, watching from above, then corrected upward. 3 seconds total this time. The canister's scent interference was real. He stored this, screwed the kerosene canister's cap off with his tail while his hands braced against the roof's peak, and waited. The creeper spread its wings and rose. Kurt bamfed to the parking lot's edge, ground level, 40 feet from the church, the moment the creature cleared the roof line, and the 3-second window began. He used one of those seconds to drench the chain with kerosene, 2/3 of the canister soaking the links in the way Gerald's matter-of-fact storage room inventory had made him hope might be possible. The chain was 8 feet of heavy galvanized steel, the kind used for equipment anchoring, thick enough that swinging it required genuine commitment. He had not survived 17 years of X-Men field operations without developing a relationship with improvised weapons. And this one, kerosene-soaked, heavy, with the potential to be set alight by the flare tucked in his belt, was the best available answer to the question of how you damage something that shrugs off bullets and walks out of barn fires. You don't stop it, he'd concluded during those 17 minutes of waiting. Gerald's data made stopping it an unrealistic objective. You hurt it. You make it reconsider. You find out if something genuinely ancient has a pain response sufficient to alter its behavior, because if it does, pain becomes leverage, and leverage becomes the architecture of a plan that might actually extend beyond the next 30 seconds. The creeper landed between him and the church. They regarded each other across 40 feet of gravel parking lot, amber floodlight casting long shadows from both of them toward the dark corn beyond. Kurt held the chain loosely in his right hand, the kerosene smell rising between them, and watched the creature's nostrils process this new olfactory data with the focused attention of something deciding whether the information changed the calculus of approach. It didn't charge, it walked. That was worse, somehow. The walking was deliberate, each footfall placed with the considered weight of something that had never needed to hurry in the entire span of its existence, that experienced urgency as a concept applicable to prey rather than predator. It closed the 40 feet in 7 steps, its coat spreading at the edges in the warm night air, its head angled slightly downward to keep Kurt in the center of its attention. Kurt lit the flare. The chemical red light hit the parking lot like a wound, painting everything in crisis colors, the church's white clapboard going the color of old blood, the creeper's coat catching the light and throwing it back in ways that made its surface seem less like fabric and more like something that had grown rather than been sewn. It stopped, 3 feet from stopping distance. The flare's light hit its face, and for the first time, Kurt saw something in those lightless eyes that was not hunger or interest or the predatory joy of the chase. Caution. There you are, Kurt thought. He spun the chain in a low arc, not overhead, not telegraphed. The flat horizontal swing of someone who had spent years fighting in confined spaces where theatrical wind-ups got you killed. And the kerosene-soaked links caught the flare's ignition as they passed through the chemical light, arriving at the creeper's left side already burning, wrapping around its torso and one folded wing, with the chain's weight driving the burning links into contact with whatever the coat was made of. The sound the creeper made was not a scream. It was something below a scream, below language, below the frequency range where human fear typically operates, a sound that belonged in the register of geological events, of things that have existed long enough that their pain expresses itself on timescales larger than human emotion. It was the sound of something very old being reminded that the universe still had edges that could find it. Kurt bamfed before the creature's arm completed its reflexive sweep, the arm that would have removed him from the parking lot with the same casual force it had used on the van's rear doors, reappearing on the church's roof, watching. The creeper burned. Not catastrophically, not in the way that would end a thing made of ordinary biology. The flames moved across its coat and the exposed skin of its hands with the concentrated intent of the kerosene, rather than the spreading hunger of a true fire. And the creature dealt with this through a process Kurt watched with horrified fascination, a kind of focused biological prioritization, its body redirecting resources toward the burned areas with a visible, rippling urgency, the flesh at its hands cycling through damage and repair in a compressed time frame that should have been impossible. The chain fell away as it burned through in 2 segments. The coat's material smoldered and then, with a wet, organic quality that no coat should possess, began to close over the damaged areas. 20 seconds. The creeper had processed a kerosene fire in 20 seconds. But it had stopped moving during those 20 seconds, and its attention had shifted from hunting to healing. And it was now looking up at Kurt on the church roof with an expression that had shed the last remnants of pleasurable novelty and arrived at something colder and more purposeful. Kurt bamfed north along the road before that expression could fully consolidate into action. He ran, chain abandoned, flare guttering in his hand, mind processing at the speed that Xavier had trained it to process when the margin between thinking and dying was measured in fractions of seconds. The fire hadn't stopped it. The fire had hurt it, had bought him 20 seconds of disorientation, had confirmed the pain response was real and sufficient to interrupt its behavior. But 20 seconds was not a weapon. 20 seconds was a data point. What he needed was a mechanism to extend those 20 seconds, to chain them together, to create a sustained interruption rather than a brief one. He thought about the between space, his between space, the dimensional fold his mutation had carved into reality through decades of use, the sulfur-smelling darkness that existed between his departure point and his arrival point for the fraction of a second his body occupied it. He had always treated it as a transit medium, a hallway with no walls that he passed through rather than used. In 17 years of field operations, he had never once considered whether the between space could be weaponized. He considered it now. Because the creeper was drawn to his teleportation, because the dimensional displacement created in it a response that was neither purely predatory nor purely cognitive, but something between, a novelty response so strong it temporarily overrode the hunting behavior. And if he could not maintain the fire long enough to matter, and if he could not outrun something with wings, and if direct combat was a guaranteed loss, then the only remaining variable was the between space itself. He bamfed again, reappearing 300 yards north and turned to face south. The creeper had taken to the air again. He could see it against the cloud cover, its wingspan enormous, its course tracking him with the patient accuracy of something that had been following things through the dark for a very long time. 4 days left in its cycle. 4 days of feeding remained before whatever biological imperative drove the dormancy period reasserted itself. 4 days were too long for the people still on these roads, which meant he had to do something that went beyond surviving the next encounter. He had to do something that changed the terms of the engagement entirely, not for his own sake, not simply to preserve his own blue-furred, dimensionally displaced, Catholic mutant existence, but for every person driving these roads in the 4 days remaining, every pair of headlights cutting through this rural dark towards something they couldn't see coming. He held the guttering flare and looked up at the circling shape against the clouds and thought about the between space, its properties, its dimensions, what it might mean to take something into it that had never been there before. He thought about what happened to things that entered spaces they were not built for. He thought about faith, specifically, the variety of faith that persists not because the evidence supports it, but because the alternative is despair. And despair, as Kurt Wagner had decided at approximately age 14, was the one luxury he could not afford. All right, he thought, let us find out what you are made of when the universe stops cooperating. He extinguished the flare. Let the darkness take the parking lot. let the creeper's wings beat their patient rhythm overhead. And he began to run toward it rather than away from it. He chose his ground carefully. 300 yards north of the church, the highway crossed a narrow drainage culvert, a concrete channel running east to west beneath the road, approximately 4 feet in diameter, designed to move agricultural runoff from one side of the fields to the other during heavy rain. Kurt had clocked it on his southward run 2 hours ago, filed it in the tactical section of his memory alongside the telephone poles, the farm stand roof, the church's tree line, the landscape's available architecture catalogued with the automatic thoroughness of someone who had learned early that environments were either weapons or obstacles, and the difference between those categories was entirely a matter of perspective. The culvert's value was specific. The creeper's wingspan, he'd estimated it at 14 to 16 feet during the parking lot engagement, made confined spaces a genuine tactical consideration, not a decisive one. The creature was strong enough to dismantle the concrete if it chose to, and it almost certainly would choose to if the confined space became a prolonged problem rather than a brief inconvenience. But brief was what Kurt was working with. Brief was the entire architecture of his plan. He bamfed to the culvert's eastern mouth and crouched inside it, the concrete cold against his palms and feet, the smell of stagnant water and clay rising around him. 8 feet of tunnel, 4 feet in diameter, with a slight downward angle draining west to east. He could stand in it hunched, move through it quickly. His body was built for exactly these geometries, the acrobatic compact musculature that had made him the X-Men's most effective infiltrator in tight spaces. The creeper, at 7+ feet with those wings, was built for exactly the opposite. Above him the wing beats slowed, circling, reacquiring. He had thought through the between-space logic obsessively in the 3 minutes of running that had preceded this moment, examining it from every angle his training and Xavier's teaching, and his own 17 years of lived experience with his mutation could bring to bear. The between-space was not empty. He had always known this at some intuitive level. The sulfur smell suggested chemistry, suggested presence. The fraction of a second transit felt like moving through something with texture rather than through a vacuum. He had never investigated further because the between space was transit, not destination, and investigating your transit medium while using it seemed like the kind of philosophical experiment best conducted in circumstances less immediately fatal than his usual operational context. But he had taken things with him before. Small things, objects he carried, equipment in his uniform's pockets. Those things made the transit intact. The between space accommodated them, extended to include them in whatever dimensional bubble his mutation generated around his body during displacement. He had never tried to take something large. He had never tried to take something that was not already in contact with his body. He had never tried to take something that was actively resisting. All 3 of those untried variables were about to be tested simultaneously, which was either the most reckless thing Kurt Wagner had ever attempted or simply the most honest acknowledgement that reckless and necessary were, in this particular rural darkness, the same word. The creeper landed at the culvert's western mouth. It filled the opening with its silhouette, hat, coat, those features arranged in the approximate geography of a face, and looked in at Kurt crouched in the darkness 8 feet away, and the expression it wore was the one he'd seen in the parking lot stripped of its final layer of predatory patience. It was done being interested. It was done cataloging. It was hungry in the pure, ancient, uncomplicated way that things are hungry when the meal has been delayed long enough that appetite overrides every other cognitive function. It began to enter the culvert. The wings folded with a sound like sails coming down, tucking against its body to fit the 4-foot diameter, and the creature moved through the confined space with a fluid, disturbing grace, its body adapting to the geometry with the boneless ease of something whose skeleton was a suggestion rather than a constraint. The tunnel's confinement didn't trouble it. It had been in smaller spaces, darker spaces, spaces that resisted it far more than a concrete drainage culvert. The 7 feet of ancient predator moved through the 4-foot tube like water finding level, and Kurt watched it come with 8 feet between them, and then 6, and then 4, and thought, "Now." He bamfed directly into the creeper. Not past it, not around it, into the space it occupied, his mutation reaching for a departure point that was technically inside another body's physical envelope, which was something he had never done, and which his between space handled by doing what his between space always did when confronted with a problem Kurt's conscious mind hadn't anticipated. It improvised. The displacement cracked like a thunderbolt in the confined concrete space, not the usual sharp bamf, but something larger, something that rang the culvert's walls like a bell and blew the stagnant water smell outward from both mouths in a pressure wave that flattened the grass on both banks. The sulfur was overwhelming, caustic, the between space expressing itself at a volume it had never been asked to produce before because it had never been asked to accommodate the forced partial displacement of 7 feet of ancient predatory biology. Kurt arrived on the highway's surface above the culvert in a crouch, gasping. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from effort, the specific full-body tremor of a mutation being used at a magnitude it had never previously reached, the dimensional attunement that powered his teleportation vibrating at a frequency that felt like it was resonating with his bone structure. He had taken something into the between space, not all of it, not intentionally. But the forced displacement had dragged a portion of the creeper's physical envelope into the transit dimension. For the fraction of a second, his body had occupied that space, and the between space had done something with that contact that Kurt did not have the theoretical framework to fully describe. From inside the culvert, a sound. The sound the creeper had made when the kerosene fire hit it had been below the register of human fear, geological, ancient, a pain expressed in timescales larger than emotion. This sound was different. This was not pain. This was confusion. This was something that had not encountered confusion in a very long time, suddenly confronting a stimulus so outside its established catalog of experiences that its processing architecture had no pre-built response pathway. The space between had left something on it, some dimensional residue, some trace of the transit fold, some contact with a type of reality the creeper's ancient biology had never interfaced with in all its centuries of feeding and regenerating, and being impervious to the things that killed everything else. It emerged from the culvert's eastern mouth slowly. The hat was gone, lost in the between space, or simply gone, irrelevant. The coat hung wrong at its left shoulder, not damaged, not burned, but displaced somehow, sitting on the creature's frame with the subtle wrongness of something that had been briefly in a place that disagreed with its geometry and had not entirely recovered. The creeper stood at the culvert's mouth and looked at Kurt on the highway above it, and for the first time in this entire engagement, it was still. Not the stillness of a predator preparing to move, the stillness of something recalibrating. Kurt pressed the advantage before the recalibration completed. He bamfed to the creature's left, close, within arm's reach, the proximity making every survival instinct he possessed scream at full volume, and bamfed again immediately, back through the space the creeper occupied, another forced partial displacement, smaller this time, more controlled, his mutation beginning to understand what he was asking of it the way muscles understand new exercises after the first agonizing repetition. The culvert rang again. The pressure wave hit the corn on both sides of the road and moved through it like a ripple in still water. The between-space residue accumulated on the creeper with each pass, each forced transit through its physical space, leaving a dimensional trace, the way water leaves mineral deposits, building a coating of between-space contact that the creature's regenerative biology had absolutely no established protocol for addressing. The creeper staggered. Kurt had never seen it stagger. In 2 hours of engagement and observation, he had seen it walk, fly, land, feed, burn and regenerate, adapt and reacquire. He had not seen it lose its footing. The stagger was small, a single step taken to maintain balance that should not have been required, but it was real, and it was the most important thing that had happened since he'd arrived on this highway, because it meant the between-space contact was accumulating faster than the creature's regenerative systems could process it. And accumulation over time was the architecture of a genuine threat rather than a temporary inconvenience. He began to move in a pattern. Not random, geometric. A series of bamfs that triangulated the creeper as a fixed point, each displacement passing through or immediately adjacent to its physical space, each one depositing more between-space residue, the sulfur building in the air around the creature until the smell was thick enough to taste. He was burning dimensional energy at a rate that would leave him non-functional within minutes. The shaking in his hands had progressed to his arms. The visual distortion at the edges of his between-space was beginning, the warning signs of a mutation being asked for more than it could sustainably provide. He had perhaps 8 bamfs remaining before his teleportation became dangerously imprecise. He used 5 of them in rapid succession, each one tighter than the last, the forced displacements building the between-space saturation around the creeper to a concentration he had no name for and no theoretical precedent to measure against. The creature was no longer staggering. It was down on one knee, one massive hand planted on the highway's asphalt, its wings half extended and trembling with the effort of a body trying to regenerate something it had never been designed to regenerate, because it had never encountered a damaged type that existed in the category of things that happen in the space between spaces. Kurt landed 10 feet away and stopped. 3 bamfs remaining, maybe 4 if he pushed past the safety threshold, which would mean risking a partial materialization inside solid matter, which would end this decisively and badly. He stood on the highway in the rural dark with the stars overhead, and the creeper on one knee before him and his hands shaking, and the between-space smell so thick in the air that his own eyes were watering, and he made himself look at what he'd done. Not with satisfaction, with the specific, complicated grief of a man who had just used the most intimate part of his own biology as a weapon against a living thing, however ancient, however monstrous, however impervious to every other form of harm, and who believed, at a level below training and below tactical calculation and below survival instinct, that even this had a moral weight that needed to be acknowledged. The creeper raised its head. Those lightless eyes found him across the 10 feet of highway, and what Kurt saw in them now was neither hunger nor interest nor the predatory joy of the chase. It was something he had not expected to find in the face of something this old and this terrible, and its presence hit him with a force disproportionate to the moment. It was recognition. Not the recognition of a predator cataloging prey. The recognition of something ancient encountered, for the first time in a very long time, something it could not simply consume and move past, something that had marked it in a way that would not regenerate, something that had reached into the between space, into the dimensional architecture of its own existence, and changed the texture of the creeper's experience of reality in a way that 4 more days of feeding and the long dormancy to follow would not undo. Kurt held its gaze. "I know you cannot stop," he said quietly. The wind had come back, moving through the corn with its dry, rattling language. "I know the cycle is not a choice you make. I know hunger at this scale is not evil, it simply is." He paused. "But I need you to understand that I will be here for the 4 days remaining, and every person on these roads is under my protection. And what I just did to you, I can do again and worse, and I will, every time you move towards someone who cannot defend themselves." The creeper was still on one knee. "This is not a threat," Kurt said. "It is information. You are old enough to know the difference." For 17 seconds he counted. Nothing moved on that highway. The stars burned. The corn rattled. The between-space residue drifted in the air between them like mist. Then the creeper stood. It stood slowly, its coat hanging wrong at that left shoulder, the hat gone forever into the between space where it would presumably remain until the dimensional fold decided otherwise. It looked at Kurt for 3 more seconds with those lightless eyes that now held something his theology had not prepared him to find in a monster's face. Then it spread its wings, the full 16 feet of them, casting a shadow that swallowed Kurt and the highway and the fields on both sides, and it rose. Not toward him, away south. Then banking east over the corn, its wing beats finding altitude in long, climbing arcs that carried it above the cloud cover and out of the acoustic range of the insect chorus. And the wind and Kurt Wagner standing alone on a 2-lane state highway with 3 bamfs left, and his hands shaking and tears he hadn't noticed cutting tracks through the blue fur of his face. He did not know if it would return. He suspected it would. The cycle had 4 days remaining, and hunger was hunger, and the between-space residue would fade as its regenerative systems adapted, because everything adapted eventually, and something that had survived this long had survived by adapting to things that should have been terminal. He would need to be ready when it came back. He would need to find Gerald and Darla, and whatever local knowledge they could provide, would need to establish a perimeter around the most traveled roads, and would need to find a way to sustain his teleportation through food and rest that the next 4 days might not generously provide. But it had gone. Tonight, in this hour, he had looked at what he'd done to it and made a calculation and chosen withdrawal. And in the 4 days remaining, every person on these roads who arrived at their destination safely, every text message sent to Mom, every crayon drawing pinned to a van's interior wall, every pair of headlights completing its journey from one side of the rural dark to the other, would do so because something ancient and unkillable had encountered a blue-furred mutant from a reality it had never tasted and decided, at least for tonight, that the cost of continuing was higher than the hunger warranted. Kurt knelt on the asphalt the way he'd knelt in the church pew, not from habit, not from performance, and pressed his shaking 3-fingered hands flat against the road's still warm surface, and said a prayer that was less petition and more acknowledgement. That he was here, that the people in those vehicles had been real. The weight of what had just happened deserved a moment of silence before the work of the remaining 4 days began. The stars burned overhead in their obscene rural brightness. Somewhere east of him, deep in the corn, something moved, not wings, not the creeper, but something smaller, something that resolved out of the stalks into the shape of a figure walking toward the road. Then another. The people from the abandoned vehicles, not all of them, not all could be recovered, but some, emerging from wherever the creeper had deposited them when it had abandoned the immediate hunt for the novelty of what Kurt represented. He rose. He walked toward them, and somewhere above the cloud cover, heading toward whatever geography called to it in the remaining days of its cycle, the creeper carried in the displaced geometry of its left shoulder a permanent dimensional scar, between space residue that no regeneration would fully resolve, a mark left by a mutant from a reality outside its catalog, proof that even the most ancient darkness could be touched by something it had never encountered. It would remember this, in the way that things old enough to predate memory remember, not as thought, not as stored narrative, but as altered instinct, as modified behavior, as a faint hesitation that would appear in the next cycle, and the one after that when the hunting brought it to a certain type of road under a certain type of sky. Whether that hesitation would be enough was a question 4 days had not yet answered. Kurt Wagner had always been comfortable with unanswered questions. They were, in his experience, where faith lived. He reached the first figure emerging from the corn, a young woman, her face pale, her eyes wide with the specific blankness of shock processing itself in real time, and he held out his 3-fingered hand, and she looked at it, and then at his face, and then took it. And in the darkness between the corn and the highway, under the burning rural stars, the blue-furred mutant from a world of gods and shadows led the survivors toward whatever light the remaining night could offer. The between space smelled of sulfur and something older. And somewhere in it, a hat drifted in the fold between dimensions, unclaimed, undamaged, a small flag planted in a space that had never been mapped, marking the place where a monster had learned, for the first time in centuries, that the universe still had rooms it hadn't entered. The story of what Kurt Wagner did on those roads in the 4 days that followed would not be written in any X-Men file or Xavier Institute record. It would exist only in Gerald's careful, reluctant memory, in Darla's dreams, in the altered behavior of something ancient that returned to dormancy on the 23rd day, carrying a scar in the geometry of its existence that it could not name and could not heal. But the people on those roads arrived where they were going. And the crayon drawing of the mountains and the yellow sun and the stick figures holding hands remained pinned to the van's interior wall, undisturbed, its optimism intact. That Kurt had decided somewhere around the 3rd day was enough. It would have to be enough. It was,